These missiles are actually really simple to make, but have a massive impact on gameplay. So in this video, I'll show you how to code them in under 10 minutes and add really satisfying visual effects. To start with, we'll make the missile. In our scene, the first thing we'll do is create a capsule sprite and call it missile. We're then going to add a 2D capsule collider so that our missile can collide with the player and walls, and also a 2D rigid body, as we'll be using physics-based movement. Finally, we're going to create a new script called missile, and open it up. In the script, we'll firstly remove Unity's comments and add variables for normal movement speed, which we'll call speed, and also rotation speed, which is how fast the missile will be able to rotate, and so its agility. We're also going to add the player transform, so we know which direction the missile should be aiming in, and the actual missile's rigid body, as we'll be using this to control the velocity. In the start, we'll also get this component. We're then going to change the normal update function to the fixed update function, as this is where the physics should be, and create a vector2 called direction. Direction is our target position, take away our position, so in this case the player transform position, take away transformed up position. And we'll normalize this for our next function, which is vector3.cross. For any of you that don't know, this calculates the cross product between two input vectors and gives us a third vector which is perpendicular to the other two. If you don't understand any of that, just know that this will tell the missile which way to turn and by how much, so that we have a smooth movement. We're then going to set the missile's angular velocity to the rotation amount multiplied by the rotation speed, and its linear velocity to transform.up multiplied by speed, as in our scene the missile is facing upwards. In the scene, I'm then going to set the missile's colour to something that suits my game a bit better, and change the movement speed to 5, and the rotation speed to 180, which should be degrees a second. We're then going to drag the player into the player transform field and test it. However, in the game, as you can see, the missile seems to be running from us, and not very quickly. So back in the script, I'm just going to add a minus in the angular velocity calculation, and as you can see, now the missile seems to be moving towards the player, although I could increase the speed a bit. The next thing we're going to add is an explode function, in which we are simply going to destroy the missile. However, we also need to call this function. So in the onCollision function, if the object we collide with is tagged player, we are going to call our explode function. However, we want the player to also be able to destroy the missile themselves, so we're also going to call our explode function if the missile hits a wall. Also, I made a mistake, please change this to GameObject. After pressing play, we can see that our code works perfectly. And that moves us on to the missile launcher. Now that we have our missile, we're going to create the missile launcher. So first we're going to create an empty GameObject and name it launcher. We're then going to add a square sprite and name that base. I'm going to change its color and scale it up a bit. Oh, whoops, wrong direction. There. Now I'm going to duplicate the base and rename the clone to barrel, which is where our missile will come out. And I'm going to change its color to the missile's. I'm also going to reposition it a bit and change the base's ordering layer so that it's in front of the barrel. Now if we compare the launcher size to the missiles, we can see that it is a bit too small, so I'm going to size it up, and now it looks good. Finally, to the parent we'll add a new script which we'll call launcher and open it up. In the script we're firstly going to remove Unity's very helpful comments and add a variable for firstly the missile prefab, which we'll create back in the scene. Also we'll add our spawn point transform, which is where the missile will be, you guessed it, spawned, and a float for the launch interval, which is the launch frequency. We'll also add a private float, last launch time, which we'll use to calculate when to launch a missile. Now in the update function, we'll create a condition that if the difference between the current time and the last launch time is larger to or equal to the launch interval, we are going to instantiate a new missile at the spawn position with the launcher's rotation. We'll also change the last launch time to the current time so that we don't get an infinite missile fountain. Back in the scene, to our launcher, we'll add an empty game object, which will be our spawn point. We'll also adjust its position to where we want the missile to launch from. And we'll drag this whole spawn point game object into the spawn position field. With the missile on scene, we are going to create a prefab out of it by dragging it into our prefab folder, and then drag it into the missile field. We'll also change the launch interval to 5 and test it. And delete the missile in the scene. However, as we can see, when the missile tries to launch, the game freezes, and that's because we have an error. If you remember, we used to give the missile the player reference manually. However, we can't do that anymore. So in the launcher script, we'll add a player transform variable, and for each new missile that we'll instantiate, we'll get its script component, which is the missile script, and in the player transform, which by the way we have to set to public in the missile script, yep, now it works. We'll set that to our player transform, which we know from the launcher. Now in the launcher, we'll drag the player into the player transform field, and if we test the game, we can see that it isn't freezing anymore. However, it still doesn't work. And that is because, as we can see in our scene, the spawn point is facing upwards, which meant during the gameplay, our missile was just trying to launch itself back into the launcher. So we'll change the rotation, and in the script we'll change the transform rotation to the spawn point rotation, which is a genuine mistake that I made. And now, as we can see in the game, it launches perfectly. Back in the scene, I'm just quickly going to change the missile's rotation speed to something a bit lower, and its normal movement speed to something a bit higher. Now, as we can see in the game, this makes it much more interesting for the player to try and dodge the missiles, and also they can smash them into the walls. And that moves us into the third part of the video, which is my favourite, the effects. In the video description I have left a link to some free assets which I'll now be using in my GitHub. Just please go to the releases section and download the file that says freemissileVFX.unity package. As soon as it has downloaded, click it and import it all into your Unity project. On missile script, we'll add a variable for our explosion effect. Make sure this is a game object. And in our explode function, we'll instantiate this explosion effect. Also, in that new game object that we just instantiated, we'll get the component particle system and call the function play, which will start the effect. Back in the game, we'll drop the explosion prefab into the missile, and in the game, we can see that we get a nice explosion when the missile collides. I'll also add a quick line of code which will let my player die every time the missile hits them. Now there is only one thing left to add, and that is the smoke trail behind the missile. For that we'll go into the missile prefab and drop the smoke effect directly onto the missile as a child. We'll also adjust the position a bit and change the order and layer so that the smoke is behind the missile. And now if we hit play, we can see that our missiles work beautifully. Also guys, please like, subscribe and share if you found this video useful, as I really put a lot of effort into it. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.